Chapter 27. The Source of the Peroxide River. Scars have the strange power to remind us that our past is real. Cormac McCarthy. I don't know how he talks. He's an interesting guy. Carl rendezvoused with Ethan and Ricky in Hewlett, Wyoming, where he scuttled the car he'd borrowed in a ditch, but without any real damage and a little cash in the glove box. It was determined Ethan would have to go through the portal in the rocks around Devil's Tower and bring 2 kittens just in case. Ethan chose Stubby, who was also fine at opening portals, and a sketchy kitten they named Cletus that was about as dumb as a post. They'd been able to practice only a few days before the whole thing sparked off. Scant practice, but the cats were quick studies and Slinky was a good teacher. Cletus was the best at opening portals, but he was unpredictable and opened several at once on more than one occasion. The cat's eyes went different directions. Ed figured that was the reason. When not being thrown haphazardly through walls, Slinky was surprisingly laid back and kept position on Carl's shoulder for the most part, though she was harnessed despite this. When it was decided Ethan should accompany Carl, Ricky cursed under his breath. "So, you're going to make me take 6 cats in an RV alone across the country to North Dakota, where I have to get into a potentially restricted area to pick you up when you eventually decide to come back, and if it takes you an hour, I've got to be on my toes a whole month." "Look, it ain't my fault Ed pieced, fam," Ethan countered. "Oh, you will find him again," Ricky said. "You are most suited, Ricky. You, FBI, you'd know things." Ricky turned to Carl and rolled his eyes. "It is the right move, of course. I'm allowed some tongue-in-cheek complaining, yes?" Ricky drove them to a point on a service road near where the trail began, and they got off to hike the rest of the way to the base of Devil's Tower. This was done so the party could avoid any surveillance equipment near the pay gate on the traditional road. Ricky watched them hike into the trees a moment, then took a deep breath and headed for North Dakota. Ethan and Carl made their way up the forested hillside and halfway around the huge escarpment where was the portal. Devil's Tower was unbelievably massive, though not as large as the conch ziggurat in the World Between Worlds. Still, it was enormous, just under 1,000 feet high, and the path around it was about a mile. Looking at it, Carl said suddenly, "It is broken tree. Stump. It is a stump, you know, Ethan." "What's that, fam?" "This," Carl indicated the formation with a gesture. "Big, petrified is the word. Petrified stump." "You sure it ain't like volcanic?" "In the flood of Noah. Also, look at the volcano. It does not look volcanic." Ethan stopped and took a moment to gaze on the great column stretching up the massive rock like claw marks from a grizzly the size of King Kong. It did indeed appear to be an ancient petrified stump, but it was much too large. He turned to Carl. "How?" "Before the water, a different world, thick air, whole world, trees, forest, jungle, moist, no rain, there was some lens, dome, a marble of water or ice, I do not know, a Meissner effect and magnetization, but it was wrapping Earth, keeping bad rays from the sun out like UV, making air more thick. So it might be tilt of Earth. It was once straight, all living things were giant, but that was then. Now, the tilt, the water, there's less. UV, there is more. Imagine what comes after nuclear war. Our world is what came after. That world is what was meant." Ethan continued squinting, then, "I'm gonna have to think that out." "Yes, here. We have arrived," Carl said, and pointed into the rocks. He followed his own finger, and in short order they had found a wide opening under a boulder the size of a small apartment. As they jumped down, incidentally, a snake was discomfited, hissed, and began to rattle. Carl shot it fast, but the sound was loud, and since they were under the boulder, this was exacerbated, terrifying the cats. The felines calmed down after a moment. Some jerky. Slinky opened a portal, and they jumped through. Others would come. Park rangers, likely enough. The gunshot had been noticeable. A second in the other place was 12 minutes in reality. As soon as they were through, Slinky expurgated, and Carl rewarded her. Through the portal, a few khaki legs could be seen in shadow for the barest of instants as it closed. In the world between worlds, the whole structure of the conch ziggurat was trembling, and a deep noise, simultaneously mechanical and biological, suffused the area. There was a strange energy in an already strange place. Despite its tremendousness, Carl was yet transfixed with an even more upsetting vision. Glowing like the moon was a sphere a fifth the size of Devil's Tower. He knew was filled top to bottom with pregnant women who were unconscious and recessed into the walls, bodies covered in a substance like white cheese, mouths filled with demonic engineering and stacked throughout the huge sphere like layers of an onion. It was impossible that there were less than thousands. The sphere rolled, and a segment of moving ground, wide as a highway, transported endless unconscious men who were taken to the edge of the rolling sphere and absorbed into it. This was the pearl of the conch ziggurat, arrayed in a chamber like the pupil of an iris, mother of pearl walls enclosing the space, the CPU of a trans-dimensional organic demonic computer. It was further limbed in alien grays like soldiers guarding in circumference as though they were an army at attention while the dictator blathered on. They stood surrounding each hemisphere of the glowing globe. Looking around, Carl saw the Greys. He made brief eye contact with Ethan as the heads of the Greys began to turn. Carl bellowed, "Begone, by Christ!" There was an explosion of green, and a cloud developed as flesh suits imploded to the ground. The green maelstrom sucked out behind them through a large distant opening like an emerald tornado of rot. Now there were the sound of steps, many steps, coming from another cavern to their left. "Grinners," Carl observed. "Ethan, the chamber of the women in cycle, this way!" And he picked up Slinky, put her on his shoulder, then began to sprint. Ethan made sure his own cats were properly zipped in his vest, then put on a sonic gun in both hands and ran after Carl. Ethan made sure his own cats were properly zipped in his vest, then put a sonic gun in both hands and ran after Carl at top speed, unable to resist looking over his shoulder every couple of steps. The chamber was huge. The footsteps echoed, but as yet he hadn't seen anyone coming through that large opening on the opposite side of the sphere. Ed managed to clear the far end of the corridor seconds before the great cylinder crashed through. Behind was the canal of the conch ziggurat. Okay, he was oriented. He must have been somewhat high within the infrastructure of the shaking building for a flying vessel to crash into it. When Ethan had performed the same feat, they were about halfway up. The shaking had taken on a new character. The whole structure now wobbled like a boat, but the motion was predictable. It wasn't anywhere near smooth. It was regular. Ed felt as though he were balancing atop a plate being spun unsteadily on a stick. He tumbled forward, aided in no small part by a mild slope to the corridor, a corridor which was growing wider and steeper and more treacherous until Ed realized he had already passed an event horizon. He was now headed where the corridor was. Period. Upon realizing this, he made an undignified noise and tried to stop, but instead fell into a slide, and the silvery floor beneath was slick. The cat dug claws into him from under the jacket and added its own yowl to his. Now they were both airborne within a massive ovoid chamber. Ed felt his arms and legs pinwheeling. He felt a thrill grip his insides, and he looked somewhere for a landing, mind racing to mitigate the fall any way possible. He need not have bothered, though. Ed realized soon he was on some sort of trajectory that wasn't strictly natural. An eddy in a stream. No pun intended. An errant breeze on the wind. He was being borne along in this way, but through the air. And in a moment he noticed something else. There were hundreds, no thousands of others. Humans, all of them, but they were unconscious and pale, and most were hairless. And they looked as though if they were alive, they were only instants away from a change in circumstance. All were male, all pale, all skinny, all frail, all unconscious, and as far from hale and healthy as the east is from the west, arms dangling behind, heads on necks as though without spines. They were all being pulled down into this great ovoid chamber, which Ed now realized was perhaps the core cylindrical area of the conch ziggurat. He could see suggestions of greater chambers up the length of it, and holes like the hexagons of a beehive all along the rounded insides, top to bottom, people piling in from them, being pulled on the eddies of gravitational wind down, down, down into a darkened cavern wide as a city, and now through into another great chamber. Emerging into this new chamber as he was drawn floating through the air, Ed saw a mighty rolling sphere like a pearl centered in its middle. Something in the back of Ed's mind reminded him of the rounded depression in the underground chamber where the sand made nightmare worlds. This pearl, it wasn't at the top of the cylinder, it was at the bottom, at the base of the conch, at its center. And Ed had just been pulled by some technological force through multiple spiraled layers of inhuman infrastructure to that center. Looking all the way up, he saw spurts of blue and a small violet point at the furthest imaginable distance, incrementally occluded by those spurts. He could see, near the top of the massive cone, where the cylinders full of abductees came and they went into the stream of energy, finally disappearing into the dark void above. After, human bodies were a dusty cloud in the distance, indiscernible to the naked eye. That human cloud was pulled back into the infrastructure of the conch ziggurat. So distant were they, it took yet a moment to realize those clouds were indeed people. About the time this registered, he noticed something else. Among their thousands were hundreds of golden lights, coming near and around some, taking briefly humanoid forms and then vanishing. But where they had been, Ed would see arms flailing, legs flailing, and now there was a low whispering mumbling on the winds of the chamber, punctuated by cries of surprise and madcap laughs. Ed realized at least some of these sounds were coming from himself. Astonishingly, he had not lost his orange sunglasses. Now the wind-blown bodies were aligned by the gravity winds together, spiraling like DNA into a helix of organized transferal, and onto a slick, fleshy platform, shuffling people toward the exterior of the pearl which turned on its axis in an uncannily lazy way that was, owing to size, simultaneously swift. The scene of people deposited into the wide chamber surrounding the pearl was yet at a substantial distance, but Ed felt the gravitational shift coming, and now, like water pushed through a tube, he and the others were collected neatly onto a cushioned receptacle that yet moved and was somehow impossible to keep steady on, especially given the strange sensation of balancing atop a plate, spinning atop a stick, that now nauseatingly defined the entire structure as it ambled along across the seabed. There were thousands of bodies behind and thousands ahead. Those who were unconscious continued to be, laying motionless on this moving tongue-like thing in an ovoid chamber, greater than a stadium, with a glowing sphere at its center. Ed managed to roll to the side of the moving organic avenue and claw his way up several feet of infrastructure to a point along the wall where he could catch his breath and take everything in. The massive tunnel through which he and others had come to a path like an interstate in Los Angeles, that tunnel extended to a point behind. They were deposited halfway to the pearl or thereabouts. The not liquid path moved incomprehensibly. Imagine if the pearl were a ball of steel dropped on a sheet, and the sheet were recessed inward owing to the ball's weight. But now imagine an abridging of the full motion of such a picture, as though the sheet were drawn eternally down, but yet remained taut, and the great steel ball never fell. What Ed was drawn onto was something like this. When he had clawed his way to the side, he could see no joints or separation between it and the wall, which was similarly colored and similarly slick. It had the appearance of a seashell's insides, but it moved like a river, and the human dust particles moved like ants atop that river as though they just weren't large enough to pierce its surface tension. The tunnel entry was the small portion of a shape like an eye. Ed pictured an eyeball turned sideways in his mind. His entry at the top where the eyelashes of either lid met. The glowing sphere, the pearl, was the pupil. The red part at the far end, well, from where he was, he couldn't quite see around the pupil. But where the impenetrable shell-colored liquid bore on the unconscious, Ed could see hundreds upon hundreds, only 1 in 10, beginning to move about and take stock of their surroundings. Some were clothed, some were not. This was like the white of the eye, but it was as though Ed were inside the eyeball. Think of an onion's shape, how it expands up, down, around, all around. So simultaneously, this impenetrable liquid was going up and down around the sides of the eyeball. But the portion Ed had entered through was a red vein right to the pupil. Stumbling with slips and slides up from the vein, Ed was able to see the people gathered in their hundreds, and they became indistinguishable one from another, like fleshy snow, until they came to the outside of the sphere where they seemed somehow to be pressed into it. It would turn, gathering them up, sucking them into itself, and rolling toward the other side of the great chamber with breakneck sloth, like a large airplane seems lazy as it cruises by at hundreds of miles per hour. As Ed went forward, he saw a vivid indigo line stretching jaggedly to the far end of the chamber, the Peroxide River. It was leaking from the other end of the pearl as it made its rotation. The peroxide was a byproduct of the final stage of abduction for those ensnared by the demons, what was left when they were totally used up. Somehow their essence was absorbed into the great glowing sphere in the center, that which was filled with unconscious pregnant human females. What remained after became peroxide for reasons Ed couldn't figure it out. It drained away and out the far end, where it became a river. But now he noticed a green color on the far end of the chamber and realized the chemical reaction they had initiated was even reaching this sacred central unholy of unholies. He moved all the faster and saw another line of impenetrable not liquid joining the main one up and away, another vein in the eyeball. But this one led to circular segments, like from the cylinder when they had crashed. Ed stumbled that direction to find a better vantage on the scene and determine what he should do. As he was doing this, he heard a sharp, loud, masculine cry. Looking back to the pupil, immediately surrounding it like an iris of gray, 1,000 points of green light erupted, becoming a roiling cyclone cloud and heading straight for him as though it were a tidal wave on the shore of the sea. Ed scrambled up the curvature he had chosen and gripped onto one of the circular cylinder segments, finding a hard lip he could grasp. A mighty wind and liquid terror combined together into the green cloud as it swept to, through, and past him, lifting him bodily like a very real wave before departing out the gravitational wind tunnel through which he had just come. He was all right. He could breathe. The fear was there, and it was intense as being soaked in ice-cold water, but just like being in such water, if you fortified your mind, you could withstand the onslaught. Now he had spiritual solid ground to grip with the toes of his soul. Just as suddenly, the cloud was gone, and he saw something else. Standing and leaning forward, Ed perceived from the left side of the chamber, what would be the longest eyelash at the middle of the eyelid, a line of men in black suits, bald heads, and dark glasses, running and firing sonic weapons toward the iris. Looking close, he saw it had to be Carl. He was the size of a mite in the distance, 1 pixel out of 1,000. But he and Ethan stood out, sand specks though they were from so far. Ed looked around, deciding what to do, then remembered his walkie-talkie, pulled it out, said, "Simp in Siberia, I have eyes. The dark side of the eyeball to your right, you can't see me. But look for the cylinder segments in a group. I'm over there, over." A second raced by and a drop of water dripped out the walkie-talkie. "Confirmed mustache ahead. Genevieve, Chloe, those with minds not dead. Regroup at the little sphere. Over." Across the chamber, Ed imagined he could see Carl waving, pointing to a globular shape that was straight ahead of Carl, but diagonally situated from Ed's position. This new sphere was only a fraction the size of the Great Pearl. Ed pocketed the walkie-talkie and turned to find his own way down, casting a glance at the circular components of the desegmented sphere as he did so. They were arranged on their sides in a little circle like some strange Stonehenge of hexagonal wrench sockets. Quite a few were there, a notable mote in this demon's eye. Several hundred at least, but even in their numbers they were only an irregularity against the flowing Newtonian knot fluid of the chamber's undulating floor. Ed was at the edge of the cylinder segment graveyard, and he could see flashes of gold and hear words and see people gradually waking as if from a nightmare, pulling varying hoses and other apparatuses from their heads, then trying to stand. He saw one sleeper who was not surrounded in gold, or the traditional gray, but a muted orange with a face. It was a face that for some reason drew Ed. It had a nose that appeared almost Roman, and seeing this, a thought bubbled up in his mind which he immediately dismissed, but despite himself muttered, "He's got a scar like a 4 on his foot." Ed's legs drew him on of their own accord. The man with the Roman nose had patches of hair on his head, and he looked sickly. Ed could feel his heart beating in his chest. The comatose individual looked, well, he could be the right age if he weren't so sick and pale. His hands were moving without his conscious direction, and discomfited the cat under the jacket who made his displeasure known. In a second, Ed had the government issue boot and its sock off, and what he saw knocked him back onto the undulating knot water, where he let out a cry. "Blake!" Immediately, Ed returned to his feet, entire body trembling in fear and surprise and hope. He went to try and wake the young man. There wasn't anything going on immediately, so Ed ripped the white cheese-like substance from atop him. The man twitched. Ed started shaking and praying as he did so. He didn't notice it, but an ACHE, ache, badge fell out of the man's far pocket, straight onto the moving knot fluid in the heart of the conch ziggurat, where it began to drift downward toward the eddies, bleeding into the pearl like a pupil filled with stolen women gestating demon progeny. On that ID was a picture of the young man with a full set of hair and a rather Roman nose, just like his mother, Amber. But the name was wrong. It should have said Blake Fogarty. What it said was Jake Farley. In the machine distance, the cogs looked like students in a class. I have to start again. In the machine dance, the cogs looked like students in a class, but it wasn't a normal class. Instead of desks and chairs, empty walls were all that greeted the eyes. Oblique exams were sprung on students without them knowing they were being tested. The students were whittled down from young crew-cut youth in their hundreds to their dozens to their tens, until there were 3 remaining. Farley remembered this part of the great parade, where the gears shaped like humans were made to spin as hard and fierce as they could, running the obstacle courses, solving the puzzles, fighting the dogs. It was the day before his 11th birthday, but he wouldn't find this out until the other boys failed and disappeared, Farley knew not where. He was seeing it all again, living it all again, but faster and slower than it was. He could see it all more vividly, that sterile odor, or rather the total absence of any smell whatever, crept once again into his mind. But everything was in an ocean somehow, one without waves. The whole school was inexplicably undulating, even as it didn't move at all. "You are found worthy of a name," said the old man in the lab coat with ACHE sewn into the lapel. "Stand 95. Farley stood. "Today is the commencement of your 11th year. In supplanting your close rivals, you are Jacob. You go by Jake, if you like. You will help in our war against the Pleiadian menace. You will provide supernatural assistance. With the line of red in your blood from the Isle of Green, you take the name Farkelech for Superwar. Spell it American. Farley. Farley. As is the custom, you are granted a request, Jake Farley, supplanter for Superwar, that may be allowed or denied you." There had always been a block in his memory here. It was hazy. He'd get distracted. The memory would never be clear. This time it was different. He remembered saying, "May I see Mr. Sunrise Eyes?" The man in the ache coat stiffened visibly. His eyes narrowed. "There is no such person." "Then why do I remember him?" A high-pitched sound came out of nowhere, but it was only for an instant. Farley knew now it was a sonic mind control device which became dangerous as its pitch went higher than human hearing. He had only heard it revving up. It didn't matter. The scene became individual units of a mosaic the size of a football field, each unit separated from the other. They began to spin together and Farley danced through his many years with ache, assignments, alignments, accidents, victories, failures, injuries, advancement. It all spun together. In a strange way, he experienced it all fully without being rooted to the temporal velocity defining those moments. Everything kept waving, undulating, moving. And now, suddenly, arms were gripping his shoulders. But there was nothing there, nothing but the psychedelic maelstrom and its muddled memories. Mr. Sunrise Eyes. Why did he remember Mr. Sunrise Eyes? In an even more distant memory, one with more color and less undulation, he could almost remember some sort of glasses. A joke about them as he walked in a group of others, all much larger than himself, all dressed very fine. Sunny day, sunny morning, comfortable temperature, uncomfortable clothes, dress clothes. They were his Sunday best. There was a woman there with auburn hair, and she talked quite a bit. A ray of sunshine through the clouds, and the man with the mustache, his glasses reflected the light in a way that lit up his whole head. "Daddy looks like Mr. Sunrise Eyes," a child's voice said. There were some laughs and further words he couldn't extract from the general impression the memory left. "Mr. Sunrise Eyes," Farley murmured. Now there was pain in his foot. The scar there, he had always wondered how he got that scar. No answers came into his mind, but there was Mr. Sunrise Eyes, bandaging it, making him laugh at something, helping him forget the pain. It was so distant. It almost hurt to remember. And then there was the music again, that strange music and the dance and the rotten colors, somehow more bright than they should have been. Yes, the living machines, the cogs and the levers and intricate things that spun on their way past the blue and the gray to the void coming on where the road led the way. But off on a path on his knees on the ground was an older man, red of hair, hands clutched together till the veins jumped out in a deep spiritual petition. As Farley watched, he felt himself drifting through the nothing world on a zephyr of mind, and now he saw himself, his hair falling away, gaunt and... "God, I don't know what to do here. I don't deserve the help, but he was a kid, and look what they did to my boy. Please, God, Jesus, pull him out, bring him back. I don't know how. Thank you after all these years. I mean, I see why it took so long. Please, please now, I'm so close. Are you going to let him just fall out like this? If you know everything you know, I don't know how to be any better. God, my boy!" Ed had been in this fashion, kneeling and praying for hardly a minute. Jake Farley's eyes snapped open. He went to gasp, but couldn't, and arched his back, soon sitting up bodily and wrenching the strange apparatus, feeding his mouth away as he came up off the slab in the circular room of the detached cylinder segment. When it came out from his throat, he retched black and fell tremblingly through the remaining white material hitherto binding him. Finally, he managed to catch a choking breath. He still wore the remains of his Ake standard wardrobe from the day they beamed him up. Ed was shocked, but looked skyward and yelled, "Thank you!" An instant later, he caught Farley as the man sagged from the slab, moving like something that had just been born out the back of a heifer. Farley was disoriented several seconds before scrambling to his own feet, leaning unsteadily on the slab and stuttering out, "Mr. Sunrise Eyes. You remember, Blake, my son, it's been... Mr. Sunrise Eyes ain't real. This ain't real." He was looking around, confused and disoriented. Ed closed his eyes and swallowed the first words that sprang to his mind, instead saying, "You remember Mr. Sunrise Eyes? Yeah, I'm that guy. More kaleidoscope. I'll get beat for the dreams. This is a real thing." Farley leaned bodily against the slab, breathing hard and weak. "I remember the old man, that Gen Z kid, and they didn't care about the pact, not even a bit." Now he took strength and stood full, looking around wildly, but unable to keep from leaving a hand on the curved wall of the detached circular room. "They took you, son. You were just a little guy." Farley looked at Clever Ed sharply. "Who?" "They did. These people, these things. He gestured all around, and now the scene came into focus. So many others on slabs and machines, but they were only in the desegmented circles, not the full cylinders. Somehow Farley sensed this was not the normal state of things. He saw blindingly bright flashes of gold at intervals, like decentralized staccato lightning all throughout the eye-shaped open space at the core of the conch ziggurat. The motion of others, pulling things from their mouths, struggling to awake, but it was all still undulating, all still rolling as the dream, as the waves, as the dance. Farley inhaled deeply, and the air was thick and strong, but he was not. He looked at his hands, pale as they were. He felt his head and was aware of the missing hair. He turned to the man in orange glasses, Mr. Sunrise Eyes. "This is still the training," he said. "Whatever it is, how about we get out of here and talk about it when the dust settles?" Clever Ed arched an eyebrow. "I don't know where this memory goes or when I had it." A cat stuck its head out of a gap in the front of the jacket Ed wore. Ed looked down, stuffing the kitten back into the garment gently. "It's my portal cat," he explained. Farley blinked at the space where the cat had been, remembering something about a portal and a cat, but it kept slipping out of his brain. It ran away from him. He met Ed's gaze. "Okay, dream on." Ed chuckled and looked away briefly, eyes straying over the other sleepers in the desegmented cylinder. He noticed several of them had begun to sink into the spongy floor on which they lay, the further cylindrical segments. When he turned back to Farley, his eye chanced to notice something familiar. "Hey, it's the college kid!" Ed ran to him and started to shake him, but was immediately repulsed. The body was cold. "Douglas," Farley said laconically. Ed removed the mask and the thin covering, rooting him to the slab beside where Farley had been. Unfortunately, Douglas had expired, and even the ghost of a smell was evident. Ed slouched and exhaled. "Guess the mystery is solved," he said, then turned to Farley and pulled out a sonic gun, giving it to him grip first. "The fellas in the black suits, they're the bad guys." Farley looked at the gun. He looked at Douglas. And clearly he felt something. But he pushed it down and focused his attention on the moment, turning to Ed and saying, "If it's not the dream, the pact is broken, and there's a lady somewhere here. Chloe." "Yeah, Chloe. Real name Claire. Some other gal. Jenny something. Longer name. Slipping my mind. Yeah, we're here for them. Up that way. Across from the big glowing moon of ladies over there. Wait a sec. You know about the Chloe girl?" "I'm responsible for her." And Blake Jake Farley Fogarty started forward weakly, wiping beads of sweat and other fluids from his face. "Hold on a sec, son. Be careful. An angel didn't come when you woke up. Are you... It sounds strange to say it, but Jesus. You find Jesus in there. Is that how you woke up?" "I had to find Jesus to come back." Farley looked at the older man in orange glasses. "You keep calling me son. I have no father." "How do you get that scratch on your foot, then?" "Ah, shit, your shoe. Hold on." Ed retrieved it in the sock while Farley leaned into the undulating ground so he could examine his foot. At length Farley said, "I never knew how I got this. I remember a bandage. There was a cookie cutter with the number 4. Ed helped Farley put the boot on, continuing, "It got left in the oven, fell out. Some sort of counting activity with local moms in your elementary school class. I don't remember. But it was on the floor in the kitchen, and you stepped your foot onto it. I don't know why. You did it deliberately. You must not have realized it was hot. It shouldn't have been left in the oven in the first place or fallen off the pan. It was my fault. I ain't no baker. I was trying to help. I left it in, and I think I must have knocked it off incidentally. Anyway, I bandaged you up, but the scar never went away. You limped for a week or so. I still feel bad about it." Farley stared at the man in sunglasses, unable to think of anything to say. Clever Ed resumed. "We don't have time. We gotta get you out of here. Then we can decompress." "Yeah," Farley agreed. Then he stood shakily, turned from Ed, brought his weapon to bear, and began moving as fast as he could towards specks of black far away, which was not very fast. The ground was shifty even without the undulating motion of the ambulating super building. Also, they weren't in range yet. But dream or real, the pact was broken, and this dominated Farley's mind. They should never have taken him up into the sky. He and Ed had made it some distance when another phenomenon developed. Those who had awakened with golden flashes. They were beginning to find their own feet as well, stumbling dazedly after Ed and Farley. Some were even calling out, "We're coming! Wait! Where are you going? What is this place? The angel said a door the size of a mountain would come." It got to the point that Ed stopped, balancing precariously on the shifting ground. He looked around, saw so many coming alive again, and reached a decision. He cupped his hands around his mouth, bellowed, "We don't know where this is going, but we're fighting it! We're on your side! You can follow us!" He didn't wait to see if anyone noticed. He resumed moving forward as fast as he could manage on the shifting ground, gun drawn. Farley was ahead of him, and continuing his stumbling advance doggedly. Behind dozens, perhaps hundreds, heard his voice.